Alright guys, now in this video I will talk about overhead absorption rate. So we have briefly discussed about overhead absorption rate, and we defined the overhead absorption rate to be a predetermined rate, something that the firm will estimate before they actually start producing the unit to trace overheads on per unit basis, right? And for that we use this equation, budgeted overheads upon budgeted activity. Now, what I want to talk about is what is budgeted activity. Now, budgeted activity is any suitable activity the firm feels will help them in tracing overheads on per unit basis. Now, the activity is not limited to just output, there can be other activities as well. So, you can have overheads being traced on machine hours, so the firm can link that how much machine hours would the product consume and trace overheads accordingly. Labor hours, those departments that are labor intensive, over there the longer that labor will work on a particular output, you will trace overheads on labor hours. Material costs, they can be departments where material would help you trace overheads on per unit basis. So if material requirement is the most important element over there, then the overheads can be linked to the cost of material. You can also link it to prime cost. Prime cost is the total of your direct cost, that is material, labor. You can trace overheads accordingly, or even unit produce rate. So we just looked at an example, which was the unit produce rate, where overheads can also be traced to the number of units produced, right? So for suitable level of activity, you need to determine the basis for OAR, and these are some of the bases that firms can use in order to trace overheads. Now, let me explain this concept through an example. What will be different over here is that instead of using output, we will trace overheads on some other suitable level of activity. All right. So now we have this factory over here. This factory is currently manufacturing two different products. You have product X and product Y. You know that X requires $10 of material per unit. Y requires $12 of material per unit. Labor, $15 per unit is required for X and $18 per unit for Y. Remember, these are your direct costs. They're already traced on per unit basis. Now, this factory makes 5,000 units of annual output and 5,000 units of annual output for Y as well. So the production is equal over here. However, we have given you certain more information, the machine hour consumption. So every unit of X that is made, X requires 1 hour of machine, whereas for every unit of Y that is made, Y requires 3 hours of machine. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that Y would need more machine hours, because for 5,000 units, Y would need in total 15,000 machine hours, whereas X would need 5,000 machine hours. All right, now we'll come back to this, but let's first take a look at the overheads. Now, this factory has the following overheads. All right, so we have rent for the year, that's $40,000, electricity bill for the year, $10,000, and salaries in total, $30,000. So we can say that annually the overheads for this factory is $80,000. Now, the question again comes over here. How do you trace these $80,000 on per unit basis? Now, if we were to trace these overheads on output, let me go back over here. So let's say I say that X makes 5,000 units and Y makes 5,000 units. So in total, this factory is making 10,000 units. So if I were to calculate the overhead absorption rate, I would say $80,000 are your overheads and 10,000 units are being made. So that's $8 per unit overhead being charged to X and Y. But what is the issue over here? The issue is this, that Y is consuming more machine hours. So it means that much of the factory's resources are being directed towards Y. So they're using more of the rent. They're using more of the electricity since they're using more machines. Supervisors need to pay more attention towards product Y. So if Y is consuming more resources for the factory, so in that case, should X and Y be both charged the same overheads per unit? That will be an unfair allocation. And what would happen in that scenario? You would charge X a higher cost and Y would be charged a lower cost. So the fair treatment would be that based on your resource consumption, products should be charged overheads. So if X is using fewer machine hours, X should be charged a lower cost per unit for overhead. Whereas for Y, since it's using more machine hours, it should be charged a higher overhead per unit. In order to do that, what we will do in this case is, instead of tracing overheads on output, we will trace overheads on their machine hour consumption. All right, so now how would we do that? Let's take a look. So I would say overhead absorption rate is budgeted overheads. Your budgeted overheads are 80,000. That's 40,000 of rent, 10,000 for electricity, 30,000 for salaries. That total overheads becomes 80,000. Now I will trace this on machine hours. How do I calculate my machine hours? Remember, X requires 1 machine hour per unit. You'll make 5,000 units of X. So 5,000 machine hours will be used for X over the year. For Y, 5,000 units times 3 machine hours per unit. That's 15,000 machine hours for Y. So in total, this factory will use 20,000 machine hours over the year. So you will trace these overheads on the suitable activity, which is machine hours. So your overhead absorption rate becomes to be $4 per machine hour. Now what does this rate mean? This rate means that any unit, be it X or Y, if they consume 1 machine hour for 1 single unit, they will be charged $4 of overheads. That's their indirect cost being charged on per unit basis. Now, using this, how do we calculate the indirect cost and the total cost? So let me show you a simple statement I've drawn. So we can say, while making a cost statement for X and Y, we know their direct cost, right? So X required $10 per unit for material, $15 as labor. So the prime cost, which is the total of the direct cost, is $25 for X, whereas Y required $12 as material, $18 as labor. So $30 is the prime cost. Remember, this cost is already available. Now what we have to calculate is overheads being charged. We just calculated the overhead absorption rate to be $4 per machine hour. Now how do I apply this? X requires 1 hour of machine per unit. So you can trace machine hour per unit. That is something you can trace. So if X requires $4 as overhead absorption rate times 1 machine hour consumed, so X will be charged $4 as overheads. Whereas on the other hand, Y requires 3 hours of machine. So Y should be charged $4 per hour times 3 machine hours, $12 per unit. You guys can compare that Y is consuming more machine hours, so it's being charged $12, whereas X is consuming fewer machine hours, so it's being charged $4 over here. So if I add this up, I will get my total cost to be $29 for X and $42 for Y. That's a simple cost statement that we make to calculate the total cost per unit using an overhead absorption rate. All right. So what we need to understand in this video is that for overhead absorption rate, it has to be traced to a suitable activity. That activity can be machine hour, labor hour, it can even be output, material. But once you determine the activity, then you use your overhead absorption rate to calculate the overhead per unit. And that will allow you to calculate the total cost per unit.